Hello, my name is Jimmy Briggs. I'm a principal of the School Foundation for Racial Justice and also a contributing writer to Vanity Fair magazine. Today, we're going to have an academic conversation with three special guests regarding the film Judas and the Black Messiah and the legacy of Chairman Fred Hampton. First, let's watch a teaser from the film.
I am proud to introduce Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party.
Hello, my friend. Good to see you.
How are you doing?
Hello, Shaka. My name is Linda Sarsour.
Thank you. It's an honor to talk to you.
Great to be here with you, good brother.
Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton of the Illinois Black Panther Party.
If you have a lot of love for your own in the face of all the fear, you can do things that are almost unheard of. And that's what Chairman Fred and the Black Panthers of the Illinois chapter proved.
It's like you said, self-love is a revolutionary and liberated act.
The film is so relevant to the movement right now. Like, if you took Fred Hampton out and you put some black and brown organizers of today, you literally can replicate the entire film with images of movements today.
I'd also love to know, what does the phrase all power to all the people, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, power to the people, I think, we can institute change, and that's the way that you do it.
Now, our panelists. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome Shaka King, the director, co-writer, and producer of Judas and the Black Messiah, who brings a long history as a television and film director and screenwriter. We also have Anika McLaren, Executive Vice President of Narrative Film at Participant and an executive producer of Judas and the Black Messiah. Anika co-heads the development and production of narrative film for Participant. Finally, we have Pastor Ben McBride, a nationally recognized activist, spiritual leader, and longtime advocate for peace and justice in the Bay Area of California. He now leads the Bring the Heat campaign, a peacemaking initiative to address police violence. Pastor Ben and his work have been profiled most recently in the Sundance award-winning documentary, The Force. Thank you for joining us. My first question is for Shaka. Shaka, could you talk to us about how this story came to you and the process when you began to research the film?
So the idea came to me from the Lucas brothers, friends of mine who basically came to me and said, look, we want to make a movie about Fred Hampton and William O'Neill that we envision as The Departed set inside the world of COINTELPRO. And I immediately saw that that was the only way you'd probably get a movie about Fred Hampton made, within Hollywood. And B, I thought it was just an opportunity to really introduce some revolutionary ideas to as wide an audience as possible.
When you have a story like this, Shaka, that's factually based on a historical figure, how do you balance, the adherence to maintaining the integrity of that person's story with, the necessary creative elements to make it more attractive or to make it, to make it more engaging for prospective audience viewers?
Well, the integrity was never really up for debate. That was at no point, did myself or my co-writer Will Burst and the Lucas brothers or, the producers, when Ryan and Charles got involved, there were no conversations about sacrificing integrity. The challenge was, like you said, making a movie that is as historically accurate as possible, fit within the confines of not only the genre that we were making, and the hour-long mark that we were aiming, the several-hour-long mark we were aiming for. But also, again, keeping in mind that the goal was to get this movie to as many people as possible. How do we make it big enough and accessible enough for everyone? And it's not easy. It was a process that, especially I'd say the first 6 drafts that Will and I wrote, we stuck incredibly close to, the events as they happened, to the point where if you look at the slug lines of those early scripts, we have the address of, you know, the Better Boys Club and Panther headquarters, and, you know, the apartment that, you know, Chairman Fred and Deborah Johnson lived in. And so after like a number of those drafts, you know, our producers kind of came to us and were like, look, you know, in order to get this script under 200 pages and make it for a budget that we can actually raise, and to get the studios to invest in this film, you know, you're going to have to make some concessions. And eventually, like, it was a battle. It was a lot of debate, but eventually we saw the utility in taking those notes. And so, you know, made some changes there. And then the family soon after got involved. And we had to contend with the fact that some of the history that we'd taken out or altered to, you know, fit our time constraint or to make the movie more dramatic, we had to address those things because they were concerns for Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. and for Akua Njeri. And so it was a negotiation, you know, in the screenwriting phase, in the directing phase, and even in post-production, you know, in terms of what to put forth out here, because we all recognize that this movie, for some people, ideally people watch this movie and they leave the theater, or, you know, they turn the TV off and they pick up their phones and start looking, oh, who was, you know, go to Wikipedia will probably be the first stop. And then hopefully it takes them down the rabbit hole. That's what we hope is the case. And I think we've made for a lot of people, I know that that's the case already of hearing that. But I think there will be those people who they'll watch the movie and that'll be it. And so knowing that, it's like we had to be aware of what we were putting forth into the world, because you don't want to damage or harm anyone's legacy, you know.
Shaka, did you feel a particular burden or responsibility? Did you feel intimidated by the endeavor at hand, just given the iconic status of the Panthers, particularly for Black Americans, but also the fact that, you know, Chairman Fred Hampton it is truly so misunderstood by most people in America?
I didn't feel intimidated. I think the only time I ever felt anything resembling that sort of feeling was when the first time myself, Ryan, Charles King, one of the producers, Zinzi Evans Kugler, one of the producers, and Rosa Clemente, who introduced us to Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. When we went to meet him in Maywood, Illinois, and we didn't realize this, you know, initially, but as soon as you stepped inside the building, you knew you were in Fred Hampton's childhood home. You knew it, you felt it, and that was intense. That was very intense because the stakes immediately were raised. Like, yes, this is, you know, this has been a script and this has been an idea we've been talking about, but when you're in the presence of those objects, you know, it's the table he ate at, you know, those artifacts that hold that weight, you're like, this is a real person. These are real people. You have to, like, as much as this matters to you as, you know, a passion project or a story you think is worth telling, it matters far, far, far more to them. And so that was the closest I think I came to sort of feeling like, okay, we can't mess this up. But the reason I think I felt relatively free of that kind of burden was my team around me. I felt like I had every possible person I could have to help me tell the story the right way, and that included Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. and Akua Njeri, and the Illinois chapter members that I consulted with prior to making the movie. So,
thank you so much, Shaka. I want to bring in Anika here. Anika, why was it so critical that participants be involved with this project, especially now at this moment in our history?
When Shaka and the producers brought the film to participant, it almost to me felt like a no-brainer. It was just the perfect mix of a story that reflected our mission, which really is the melding of art and activism. I also, was familiar with Shaka's work and was a tremendous fan. And so we were also interested in supporting his voice. And, it's not really every day that a movie about Chairman Fred Hampton lands on your desk. And so it really was intuitive and felt like a really exciting opportunity for us to contribute to conversations around racial inequality. I also think it's worth stating that it was well before the pandemic and the incidents that happened in 2020. And so it really just was sort of a coincidence of sorts that the movie was taking place and we were able to invest in the film and contribute when we did.
And your involvement actually precedes participant. I'm curious, you personally, if you're able to speak to it, what do you personally, as an African-American woman working in the film industry?
Yeah, I honestly, I had heard the pitch previously at another job at Fox Searchlight, and it was really one that I just really loved for a while. And so, seeing it kind of get set up at Warner Brothers and then Participant, me working at Participant and then being able to be involved in, the way that I could be was just, honestly, it was a dream come true. And I don't say that lightly. I think there's very few projects that feel authentic to the African American experience that are being made by African Americans. And so it just was felt like a bolt of lightning.
Thank you, Anika. I want to bring in Pastor Ben into our conversation as well. Pastor Ben, you have a long, durable history in grassroots frontline activism, both in the Bay Area and nationally. Judas and the Black Messiah begins focusing on the Black Panther Party, speaking to the origins, if you will, the beginnings of the group's history. Could you contextualize for us, why the Panthers existed when they did, and what gaps or what need were they serving?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important for us to recognize that the Panthers showed up at a time not out of some kind of a project, but they showed up out of deep necessity. Black people in the city of Oakland, California, were dealing with a very, really real situation. You had Black people who had left the South, Black people who had moved all the way to California, trying to get away from Jim Crow, only to come and get in touch with James Crow and Jimmy Crow, and thought they were getting away from the South and got away from Alabama, only to come out to find Calabama in the middle of West Oakland. And I think one of the things, it's a situation that Black people have continued to find ourselves in over and over. And Black people found themselves in that situation in the 60s, where they were finding that the state itself was providing a kind of violence and a kind of structural injustice that demanded for them to organize themselves together, not just around the notions of self-defense, but around the notions of health and really around the notions of self-determination. But I think it's important to recognize that the Black Panther Party is not just who it's been caricaturized to be in history, but you're talking about a movement before it was popular that was anti-fascist, that was anti-imperial, that was anti-racist, that was anti-capitalistic, that was really calling for a brand new vision of America, a brand new vision of what it meant to be community. And so I think when we think about the Black Panther Party, we think about its legacy. It had a deep legacy of calling out the contradictions. It had a deep legacy of trying to get us to raise our analysis and really understand what is the role of the state in our lives. What should that role be? And do we really believe that freedom is served by us just engaging with incremental strategies? Or is freedom really served and delivered by us really leading in more of a revolutionary orientation? And I think they started and continued that debate there. And I think we're still having that conversation now.
One of the things, Pastor Ben, that strikes me, especially about, even before Judas and the Black Messiah, the film, it strikes me about the Panther Party in particular, is that so many of the things they tried to do, that the allyship, which Shaka depicts so viscerally in the film, Latino, white, Black, finding common ground, if you will, common humanity, shared humanity, and the work for justice. The free meals program for young people. There's so many things that they did, which I think is cemented in their legacy. Could you speak to other aspects of the Black Panther narrative that really has stayed with us since the group's gradual dissolution in the 1970s and 80s?
Yeah, it was actually cool. I had a conversation with Chairman Fred Hampton Jr., and we were talking about this notion of unity and this notion of what does it mean to find common ground and bridge across difference. And one of the things he was lifting up that was super insightful was that his father didn't just bridge across difference for bridging across difference sake. He didn't just try to find unity for unity's sake, but it was around what does it mean for us to come together around shared principles, around shared ideas, around a shared philosophy. Now, in order for us to have a collective future, we're going to have some common memory. And so I think Fred Hampton really displayed for us in a very hot political moment that he could find things that he had in common with the young white brothers and sisters at the Patriot Party. He could find things in common with the young lords and the Latino brothers of Chicago and sisters. He could find things in common even with some of the street organizations that were getting down, all for the purpose of trying to figure out how do we land at some kind of collective future for the things that we can have in common. And I think at moments like this, the fact of the matter is we can't organize with everybody, but we do got to organize, right? I mean, I like that some of our elders have taught us over the years, right, that an organized lie is always more powerful than disorganized truth. So we got to organize the truth, and we got to figure out how we do that with some shared ideology across difference. I think he did that in his time. But one of the things I think that the film brings out super beautifully that I just love that it's on film around that was he wasn't just reaching out to other people who were politicized in the way that we understand what it means to be politicized, but he was reaching out to other street organizations, real cats, real sisters and brothers that's on the concrete, right? And I think the reality is you judge a society not by how the best are doing, but how the people who are most oppressed are doing. And I think in that same way, the film is inviting us to recognize who are the people that we need to be listening to that we're not listening to. Just one quick story, I would say. When we were on the streets of Ferguson, we was getting down with some of the young brothers, Tefbo and T-Dubs and Sister Ashley and Rika. We were all out there on the block, right? And we were having a good time. We turned it up, turn it up for Mike Brown, doing what we need to do. But it was something I remember that Tef told me that stayed with me. He said, listen, bro, I appreciate that you here from Oakland. Here's my question. Where is the Tef in Oakland? How are you in touch with the young brother, the young sister, the young relative in Oakland that needs that get down? And so I think it's important for us, and the film brings it out for us. I think Fred Hampton's life brings it out for us, that none of us are free until all of us are free. And particularly, like Glenn Martin says, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So we need to be thinking about how are we activating not just organized people and people that folks are comfortable with, but even street organizations, Pookie, Ray Ray, Taisha, and Jaime. Until they're at the table, we're really not talking about nothing.
Along those same lines, what blew me away in studying and researching the movie was how politicized those street organizations were already and how that had been kept from us historically. And even the use of the terminology street organizations, a whole time we come up, we're talking about gangs, we call them gangs, they're referred to as gangs. But if you look at the history of quote unquote gangs in Chicago, they started out to protect Black people from being beaten up by white gangs. So, and when you look into the history, the Vice Lords and the Stones, like businesses, you're talking about folks who had business who were employing other Black folks who were really they were really incredibly forward thinking, not what you think of when you think of gangs, not just out here committing crimes. Like it blew my mind. And so it made so much sense to me that the Panthers and the street organizations had this interest in coming together because in a lot of ways they were thinking along similar lines,
I so appreciate that insight, Chaka, and especially what you said, Pastor Ben. I think I may have shared this with you before, but Ben, I actually grew up near Ferguson. My mom taught there, so I'm very familiar with the folks the names you mentioned. I want to pick up on that thread that you and Shaka just elevated, but I want to first go back to Anika. It's interesting for me, Anika, as an observer. In the past 6 months, participant has has produced, has helped birth, two projects which I feel, from my perspective, uphold real life superheroes. John Lewis, Good Trouble, and now Fred Hampton with Judas and the Black Messiah. And I'm curious from your perspective, how do you see, how do you hold the importance of supporting storytellers, story makers such as Shaka and others who are dedicated to authentically lifting up, the lives of these historical figures with the nuance, with the care for protecting legacy, for honoring dignity of these individuals?
So much of the journey for all of our films really does start with the filmmaker. And so, I think it's always a tricky prospect when you are telling a story that is true, but especially in my opinion, when it is about Black people, and there's so few of our stories of our historical figures who have really, amazing movies and prominent movies made about them. And so I would say that, the first thing really is to understand the intention of the filmmaker. I think in Shaka's case, he's really, a kind of key example of someone whose passion for the material, almost a decade-long journey. And, I think that there's a care of actually telling the truth in the movie. And that truth can be literal or it can be an emotional truth. And in the best case, it's, both. And so for us, it really is about, does the filmmaker's intention live up to the story of the hero's journey that we're, trying to articulate. And so I think, as much as I think some of it is intuitive, I think the trappings for people who maybe aren't Black or whose experience or ideals aren't reflected in the material is really about just being really honest about what the takeaway is that you want people to have from the film. And, Shaka also was so passionate and committed to his vision. And I think we also look for that passion. Don Porter had it. Many of the filmmakers we have, this isn't just any movie. This isn't a job. This is something that they feel sort of born to make for one reason or another.
Thank you so much for that, Amika. I appreciate the nuance of your candor of your response. I want to go to Shaka. If I may speak personally, when I saw this film, I've seen it 3 times now. For me, it hit me on several levels. One, I think we spoke about this previously. I think I love the fact that hopefully for a new audience, it will introduce them or reintroduce to others. I think what I call the tool or the gift of eyes on the prize. You include footage from William O'Neill, the real life William O'Neill, speaking to interviewers about why he did what he did, and planting himself for the Chicago, Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. But also, just frankly speaking, as a Black American, what strikes me over and over every time I see the film, see the trailer, is love, pride, and passion. Wow, this was a Black man who stood up, who was a hero. And I'm just curious, Shaka, as a filmmaker, and in this case, who do you see as the audience for this film? Who do you feel? I think everyone needs to see it or should see it. I've been doing my individual part to help make that happen as much as I can for myself. But I'm curious, who's the audience that you intended this film for, or is there different messages for the audiences you hope come to see this film?
I think different audiences, always bring to the table their own sort of personal experience, and I've always said that a lot of times films actually tell you more about the people who watching them than the people who made them. But in the case of this film, first and foremost, I was making this for Black people to start. That was what I was starting with. And you know, that informs everything. It informs, you know, whether you choose to how you shoot the assassination, how you film the assassination, you know, how you come into the material, you know, starting with the archival, allowing the Black Panthers to speak for themselves, as opposed to starting with J. Edgar Hoover and having him provide context as to who these individuals are. But then, you know, you're also, so you start there and then you build out, right? So it was like, and it was, I learned a lot of lessons in this because, you know, coming at it from that vantage point to start, and then realizing, well, okay, yeah, you are making this for Black folks, but how familiar are Black folks with Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party as a whole? You're making this for young people too. They have probably zero context, many of them, in terms of, you know, for them, the first time they heard Black Panther was when the Marvel movie came out for a lot of young folks, you know? And so, you know, you have to think about that and contextualize and give some sense of like, just like, what was the world like then? Who were these people? What you know, what were they doing? And then you're building out as you know, work the material. You're building it for a bigger audience and a bigger audience, and you're going to let more people in, because ultimately, you know, I think that, like I said, you know, in starting it, the movie has different utility for different viewers. You know, I think, and I know this for a fact, having fortunately before the pandemic hit, watched the movie with, you know, about 7 people. You know, I think half of our audience was white, half our audience was Black, and the ways in which different, you know, people viewed, for example, the character of Roy Mitchell, how our white audience members viewed him versus how our Black audience members viewed him, was fascinating to watch, you know, and what they took away from that character, and the conversations that they had around that character after the screening was like, it just made me so excited, because I think that that's what you want as a filmmaker, you know.
Thank you for that, Shaka. One final question for Pastor Ben. Pastor Ben, how do we successfully contextualize and ground the work, the legacy of the Black Panthers for today's generation of frontline racial justice activists? We're in a period of our history where the impact, the trials, the failures, the successes of groups like the Black Panthers is largely unknown or effectively dehistoricized.
Yeah, you know, one of my favorite authors, a theological writer named Rob Bell, he talks about the Bible, and he says, is the Bible true because it happened, or is it true because it happens? And I think when I think about the notion of this story and Judas and the Black Messiah, is it true just because it happened, or is it true because it happens? It happened before and it keeps happening, right? This notion that this country, and Ferguson showed it for us even more, has still yet to have a full reckoning on the violence of its origin and who it is. You know, America is like somebody who refuses to look in the mirror. And so this movie brings out what Black people have been doing for hundreds of years: cycles of resisting white supremacy, cycles of organizing themselves with ourselves and with others who were willing to be a part of some type of revolutionary or liberation movement and work. And the response from the state that some more progressive folks who still have imperial tendencies are willing to participate a little bit before they bring the strength of the state against Black people trying to get free, or those who are just fully down with white supremacy that bring the whole power of the state against Black people whenever we want to get free. We saw it in Ferguson with the kind of COINTELPRO-like tactics that they put upon young people who were leading the resistance, who didn't even have any money, and yet they brought the full vestige of the United States government against young Black people, terrorizing them, tapping their phones, putting informants inside movement and communities to try to break up what was happening in that uprising. And we are continuing to see it happen even right now in the moments that we're in. I think this film is incredibly important because there is an important conversation that needs to lead to action that has to happen in this country, where at some point, people who are not Black have to recognize that Black people understand exactly who this country is. We have an analysis around it. And if this country is ever going to get free, it's going to be because of the willingness of those who have more power and privilege to follow those who have been most prevented and persecuted by this state, which is Black people. And so I think, whether it's Ferguson, whether it was the LA uprising after the beating of Rodney King, whether it was the Oakland uprising in 2009 after the murder of Oscar Grant, or whether it's the uprising that happened in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. I think that the questions that this film is raising are ones that we got to continue to ask ourselves. Where is the crime? Who are the curators of the conditions that place Black people in situations where we disproportionately do not have health, are more prone to be incarcerated, to face violent acts, to lack education? Who are the curators of those conditions? And what does it mean for us in the spirit of a revolutionary to go about undoing not just those conditions, but challenging the power of those curators? I think that's what the Black Panther Party was about. It's been what every iteration of the Black liberation struggle has been about. And I think this film invites us to figure out in our moment. We saw what Chairman Fred did in his. The question is, what are we willing to do in ours?
Thank you, Shaka King. Thank you, Anika McLaren. Thank you, Pastor Ben McBride, for your wisdom and insight. And thank you all in the audience so much for tuning in. And please enjoy the rest of today's programming. Also, to learn more about and support the campaign tied to this film, visit www.liveforthepeople.com. Thank you.